Our second topic for this week, week 12, are what we call the Northern Crusades collectively. Really, I suppose Scandinavian and Eastern European Crusades is probably more apt because that's largely where we're talking about. I mean, it is North, obviously. But we're particularly talking about the bits to the east. So the area around the Baltic Sea, the Baltic countries, you should be able to see me hovering over the modern Google map. So the Baltic, parts of Scandinavia, also the area known as Prussia, as well as modern day Estonia, Finland. So really, it's really all the parts along the bottom of the Baltic Sea here. As not as far west as many parts of Germany. Although if you've heard of Prussia before, probably is in the context of much later German history. But very different kettle of fish now today. So these crusades, they don't necessarily chronologically fit the way the Albigensian crusades so neatly do before we move on to the fourth crusade next week. But rather they're within this broader theme of, hey, look, is the meaning of what it is to go on crusade changing, which is our big discussion topic again with this flip grid. So the Baltic Crusades, they lasted from the 12th century on until the 16th century. So they're pretty long in duration and they last longer than a lot of the other crusades, as we'll see. So the first ones to be authorized by the Pope were back in 1147 to the southwest Baltic. And then the last crusading bull was sent in 1505. So much later than what's going to be taking place in the east. Now, you might be like, okay, why the Baltic? Okay, we've looked at why the south of France, why the Baltic? Well, it's not Christians. It's not the what they view as an errant type of heretical Christian here. Now, up here are still pagans. There are still pagan communities in the Baltic area. So they are considered kind of tantamount to Muslims in that they're not even Christians. They can't even be considered heretical Christians. So the other thing is that this impacts their political organization, their social organization. For example, there's one group called the Wends, and their pagan religion, it's very tightly bound up with their civil organization. It's very bound up with landscape and place. They've got lots of holy places in their countryside. And they have a whole priestly class as well to manage for them. So their priests are political leaders too. They're community leaders. They lead them in times of peace and of war. So this is obviously the political context we've just talked about in the Albigensian situation. Most of the people who are traveling here to convert are from Germany. They're Germans. So they start off with missionary activity, trying to convert. So there are missions sent in 1124 and 1127. But these are largely unsuccessful. There had been missions to the Balts. They're another one of these from where the name Baltic gets it from the tribe called the Balts. They had been attempted to be converted to Christianity as far back as the 10th century, but these missionary activities had been very unsuccessful. What has been leading to the eruption of tension by the time we hit the middle of the 12th century is that there's trade going on between the pagan areas around the Baltic Sea and elsewhere, and also raiding activity. So there's quite a lot of friction. St. Bernard of Clairvaux, we're going to talk about him again shortly, and we've met him before. He approached the Pope and the French king and other leaders to authorize a crusade against the Wends for these various reasons. And he was approved in doing this. Another thing that seems to be going on here, if we're going to we need to look at the cynical side of it. I want you to look to the south of this map. Here's Ukraine, okay, Belarus, and think about where is further south to Ukraine, and even today what the dominant religion is in Ukraine. and that is the Eastern Orthodox Church. So the other thing that the likes of Bernard of Clairvaux are worried about is if we don't get there, we being the Catholics, we don't get there and convert these pagans, then the Eastern Orthodox Church is going to get there before us, and they're going to become Eastern Orthodox. And I do not need to tell you about all the background there. You are well familiar in this. They also want conversion, they want more money, and they also want to have control in Germany. Because Germany has been politically a bit troubled at this time. So the Baltic is very unlike other places we've talked about. Here's some pictures of the landscape. It is cold. It is definitely a frontier, but it's a cold frontier. The people who, live in a rural areas, very rural dominated society, the ones who live beyond the towns and settled areas, they are practicing agriculture, but they're pretty vulnerable to the climate, weather, other conditions. Of course, we know across medieval Europe, East and West, people are relying on arable agriculture, that is growing crops. So in a cold frontier region, relying on growing grain is a very risky activity. It has been a long time trading partner for places further to the west. They particularly have had relationships with other Christian parts of Scandinavia, like Denmark and Sweden. And the kings of Denmark and Sweden were also starting to convert those people that they were extensively trading with to their east. By this point, the king Denmark and Sweden were pretty solidly Christian. The last openly heathen king of these areas died at the end of the 11th century. So there are many different groups of people living in this part of the world. They have a lot of differences, but they have a lot of commonalities. But for the most part, they're largely what we would call tribal, and I do not mean that to have any negative connotations. Alas, that term tribal has moved away from its historical anthropological meaning and kind of has negative connotations attached to it. But importantly, they have a different social and political organization, and many of them were not Christian. So we get to the point then, why did they think that conversion could be best accomplished by military force, and not the way that Europe had been re-Christianized after the collapse of the Western Roman Empire? When other parts of Scandinavia even, let alone other parts of Western Europe and other originally pagan Germanic barbarian tribes in the early Middle Ages have been migrating. They had to be converted from their pagan beliefs to Christianity. And for the most part, that was done through missionary activity. So why don't they think that they can apply the same techniques to the Baltic area? Well, a lot of people did think that they should do it conversion through missionary activity, not by the sword. But we do have the cynical reasons that there's a very militaristic society living in these areas, that it's a very militaristic society that wants to politically impact these regions. And are they motivated by religion, or are they motivated by greed and by land? There's also, as we know, the belief at this time period that you really got to defeat the devil by any means necessary. And we see that also in the Albigensian Crusades. As we know, this is part of, it's not even just an isolated experience. Conversion of people to Christianity and wars against those who are not Orthodox Christian. It's a global affair at this point. So the Baltic area no doubt gets sucked up into this sort of global mindset, rather being treated as part of a global pattern rather than as an individual case. But of course, unlike our views today, in the medieval mindset, all these things could comfortably coexist. particularly since previous missionary attempts had ended very bloodily. Most of the missionaries who went up to this part of the world to convert these pagan societies ended up being martyred for their efforts. So it's kind of this attitude of, we need to avenge them because the Baltic soil has been stained with their blood. The church is also thinking not just in terms of getting one over the Eastern Orthodox Church, but also more people equals more tithes, more income for the church as well. This is an untapped part of the world. Like with the Albigensian Crusades, we finished off that video by me mentioning the Dominican order, a religious monastic order, and how they led efforts for Inquisition, and how it was this that really rooted out the heresy of Catharism. And we do kind of have a parallel in the north in this regard, only this time it's the Cistercians. Now, we have met the Cistercians before because when we did the Second Crusade, we looked at Bernard of Clairvaux. So we're back with Bernard of Clairvaux again. Remember, he is the founder of the Cistercian order, and if you think back to last week, he managed to found hundreds, under his own abbacy, hundreds of Cistercian houses. So the Cistercians play a big role in the Northern Crusades. It's part of St. Bernard's master plan. He wants monastic colonization of the Baltic area. And actually, this sits really well with the whole mission of the Cistercians. Cistercians, remember, are trying to get away from the corrupting influence of the world. They want to be as self-sufficient as possible so that they can spend their time contemplating religion and God. So this has led a lot of people to describe the Cistercians as having a wilderness mission. Lots of parallels about how they found their monasteries in the wilderness. And this comes out of a much longer Christian tradition. You know, back in the early days of Christianity, there were the desert forefathers who literally lived in the desert, or, you know, the guy who lived on top of a pillar. It's coming out of a much longer tradition of keeping away from corrupting influences. And to the Cistercians, it's finding wilderness, finding places that have hard terrain and that have low populations. So this is a very appealing frontier for the Cistercians to go and find their monasteries. This is to them the religious ideal for them. Oh, we can go and live in a harsh climate surrounded by pagans, and we'll have our spirituality tested. So the Cistercians also are some of the few groups who are going to be able to hack this harsh landscape. Even looking at these pictures, and these are modern, so obviously the landscape back in the Middle Ages looks nothing like the landscape today, but you can see that, yeah, there's significant tracts of grass for grazing, but also it's still very rocky, very forested, and lots of water as well. The Cistercians have a long history of being successful at agriculture in these more frontier regions. In fact, they have a reputation for being agricultural innovators, and particularly in terms of sheep farming, and expanding their knowledge of agriculture to new parts of the medieval world. So the Cistercians trek out to this part pretty early on in the day. They are sent out from the mother house of the Clairvaux monastery, and this, you know, they were hugely popular. And because they had this network of mother and daughter houses, back in the Second Crusade, it kept that errant monk Ralph under control. Here it's used to colonize. So the Northern Crusades were organized in ways we might not be very used to. Therefore, while I'm making very sweeping generalizations in this video this week, I would like you to go and read chapter 8 from Christensen that is posted to Moodle. So Eric Christensen has written like this giant tome on the Northern Crusades. Personally, I find it very dense, but I know that that is not the case for a lot of people. A lot of people find the Northern Crusades very gripping. But he did write sort of the masterpiece. So I find chapter 8 a pretty hard read, but that actually just seems to be just me. A lot of people seem to enjoy it. So the organization, this is what the area roughly looked like in the late 13th, early 14th century. So we're dealing with terminology that still describes parts of the world we have today, like Estonia. But Estonia, also Prussia, and an area called Livonia were under the Teutonic Knights and monks as well. And so the government is very much shaped by the monastic command structure. I'm going to explain in my next video about the Teutonic Knights and why this is significant. So if you're like, hang on, pause there, I will be coming back to it, don't worry. Enough to say that it's not just the Cistercian monks that are involved in this enterprise, there's other forms also. And so they implement government how they know it, which is following monastic orders. Now, this does mean that continuity is ensured and that they have rulers with experience of ruling territories and large groups of men as well. Over time, they become a lot less religious in terms of their orientation and instead start behaving much more like traditional noblemen from other parts of Europe. Sweden at this time, it's the purple bit, rules, as you can see, a big chunk of Finland. So these Swedish nobles were under, Finnish and Swedish nobles were under the Swedish king. The social structure of this area meant that most peasants were the natives. They were the peasants who were doing most of the toil and graft, were not Swedes or monks, but rather the native population who were originally pagan and then forced to convert. And this means that they were not treated very well. Some of them were nominally Christian, but they were expected across the board to owe a lot to their ruling lords. And I mean, obviously, in feudalism, this is the case everywhere, but even in feudal standards, they are a lot more indebted to their lords than elsewhere in Europe, leading to the point that it's less feudalism in this part of the world and more colonialism, that they really are extracting as much as they can from the native population. Now, they're not slaves, but they're not that much above. They are technically free, but they're kind of the next step. On the other hand, if you went, even if you weren't a monk, if you were a lay person and you followed the crusading warfare and the monks into the Baltic area, you could potentially do very well. And this means that a lot of people from Germany who were not part of religious hierarchies, they were ordinary peasants and farmers, they knew that if they headed east, they could do very well for themselves. They were given deliberately, as part of the policy, really good incentives to go east, including fewer feudal obligations and the opportunity to have their own land, have more of legal independence, and potentially get quite rich. So this includes Germans going from, Germany into areas further east, like Prussia and Estonia. Also, Swedes moving into Finland. That movement as well. So this is also why we describe this Northern Crusades as colonialism. There is deliberate colonization going hand in hand with the fighting. We see this particularly in castles and in towns. The pagan tribal society that existed here prior to the Crusades was very rural. They lived in the countryside. They did not have nucleated settlement. However, colonization meant the formation of towns, and they colonized from urban areas outwards. It is also still a very militaristic society, and this also makes it very colonial in nature. For example, even in terms of their religious beliefs, the most popular saints were the soldier saints, and there's a lot of emphasis on the martyrdom in that area too. So I would like you to, in your flip grid, Jill Claster asks whether the Northern Crusades even really deserve that title. Are they a complete anomaly? You know, should we be putting them in with the likes of the Reconquista and the Albigensian Crusades? Are they religious crusades, or are they really just part of German colonial expansion? So that's one of the topics for you to consider into the in the Flipgrids. Needless to say, the events of the Crusades profoundly changed this region of Europe. They really just imported Western medieval feudal culture. And of course, we've already seen where they did that elsewhere. They did that in the Holy Lands. They're kind of going to do it when they get into the New World as well. It also changes the area in that it does become very firmly Christian, Catholic Christian, but it also becomes very culturally Germanic for centuries after. Okay, so I'm going to stop this video right here, and instead I'm going to turn to my next video, which is going to explain these military orders. I've already mentioned one of them, the Teutonic Knights, but we haven't talked about them yet in class. So the next video is going to give you a very quick overview as to who they were, what they were about.